I was never one to have spiritual dreams or visions. I've always been skeptical of that sort of thing, even though I've believed in God since I was little. But what happened to me on a Sunday morning last year shook me to my core. I woke up different that day. I can't explain it, but I felt a strange weight in the environment, as if the air were denser. It was an ordinary day, nothing special. Yet inside me it seemed that something was about to happen. I decided not to go to church, which is rare for me, and I stayed at home alone, quiet, almost without knowing why. Around 10 in the morning, I sat on the couch and began to pray silently. I didn't ask for anything specific. I just said, "Lord, speak to me." I wasn't expecting anything. I just wanted to feel peace. And then, without even closing my eyes, I experienced something I can only call a vision. It wasn't like a dream. I was awake, totally conscious, but I saw something that has deeply marked me to this day. Before me appeared a gigantic, imposing figure, impossible to describe fairly. It was a lion, golden, strong, eyes like burning embers. But what impacted me most were the wings. They were eagle wings, immense, spread as if ready to take flight. Yet at that moment, the lion was not flying. It roared with fury, and everything around trembled, as if the very earth were bowing before it. I felt minuscule. A different kind of fear took hold of me. It wasn't the kind of fear one feels in the face of physical danger. It was a spiritual dread. It was as if I were facing something that symbolized absolute power, but corrupted. Then the wings were violently torn away. Not by human hands. It was as if the very sky had done it. The lion fell, staggered, and then stood up like a man. Its expression changed. Its eyes became sad. It was as if it had been broken from within. I was paralyzed, watching as if time had stopped. It was like witnessing something revealed only for me, without noise, without explanation, but with a weight that crushed the soul. I felt that the lion represented something much greater than an animal. It came into my heart very clearly. Babylon. I hadn't studied much about that before, but in that moment, the name came with such force that it seemed someone had whispered it directly into my spirit. Then, I began to remember everything I had heard about King Nebuchadnezzar, his pride, his fall, and the way God humbled him until he recognized that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men. That wasn't just a theological recollection. It was as if I were seeing the very essence of that empire, that spirit of arrogance and dominion being unmasked before me. The lion without wings was no longer the same. It was vulnerable, human, broken, yet still dangerous. While I tried to understand what all of that meant, I began to feel something more. As if that vision was not only about the past, but about the present, and in some way the future too. My heart raced. When I realized that the torn wings had not disappeared, they had been thrown into the sky. And then I saw another scene, a symbol very familiar to me, a lone eagle. But this time, it was alone, soaring over cities, seas, forests. It was clear. It was the representation of the United States. I didn't want to admit it at the time, but it was as if the spirit was making it clear within me. The spirit of Babylon did not die with the ancient empire. It continued. It changed its face. It changed its throne, but it remains the same. In that moment, I felt a mix of dread and understanding. I began to notice things I had never connected before. Symbols, behaviors, the arrogance of modern culture, all connected to something much older and more spiritual than I had imagined. After that, I started trembling. Not physically, it was something deeper, as if my spirit were being shaken. The presence of God became heavy in the room. I couldn't speak. I only looked at that solitary eagle in the sky, as if it were the echo of the wings that had been taken from the lion. And then, right before my eyes, that eagle began to lose altitude. It wasn't a sudden fall, but a slow descent, as if it were running out of strength. And when it got close to the ground, it no longer had its previous imposing nature. Its feathers were stained, its eyes darkened. It looked tired, injured, and there, beside it, began to emerge a figure without a defined shape. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was like a dense shadow, spreading slowly, covering everything. A terrible sensation took hold of me, something I can only describe as the spirit of Babylon reappearing, but now faceless, without a clear identity, just a power that seeps in. At that moment, I understood that what I was seeing was not just an allegory about empires. It was a warning, a call. Something was being shown to me, not because I was special, but because God wanted me to know and perhaps to share. The vision continued, but now, without clear figures. The environment changed. It was as if I were seeing the current world, but with different eyes. I saw buildings, people, governments, but there was a spiritual fog covering everything, like an invisible web. This web connected the dots, the media, politics, entertainment, economies, all connected by the same spirit, the same influence, the same Babylon that fell in the past, but that now acted in a more subtle way. And then a phrase came to my mind, as clear as if someone had spoken right next to me. It didn't die, it only learned to disguise itself. I sat there for a long time trying to process what was happening. There were no more clear images, but the feeling of being connected to something much greater than myself was almost unbearable. It wasn't a beautiful vision. It wasn't something that made me feel elated. It was heavy, real, and painful. I felt shame. I began to remember the times when I had allowed myself to be seduced by everything that I now understood as part of this system: vanity, the quest for status, excessive consumption, spiritual pride. Babylon is not only external, I realized, it also tries to dwell within us. I saw myself small in the face of it all. I felt like crying, and I cried, not from emotion but from repentance, as if the Spirit were cleansing me while revealing. There was no noise, no angel, no thunder, just a presence that made me understand without needing explanations. At that very moment, without having planned it, I got up and went to the shelf where my Bibles and books are kept. I grabbed the book of Daniel and began to leaf through it hurriedly until I found the part about the vision of the 4 beasts. When I read about the lion with eagle's wings, I felt a shiver run through my body. It was there, exactly as I had seen it. But now, with the eyes of experience, I noticed details that before had gone unnoticed. The lion with wings that were torn away, the heart of a man being given to it. It was as if I had lived that on a spiritual level, and now I was seeing on paper the seal of confirmation. The text spoke of something ancient, yes, but everything inside me screamed that it was for today. It was as if the Spirit was saying, pay attention, because the cycle is repeating. And that brought me a sense of urgency I had never felt before. I spent the rest of the morning in silence, sitting on the floor of the living room with the Bible open on my lap. I couldn't even pray properly. I could only keep repeating within me, Lord, show me what to do with this, because one thing is to have a strong experience, another is to know how to live after it. I looked around my own home and began to see traces of this spiritual Babylon in small things, TV programs, phone conversations, even in the way I organized my time. It was as if the vision had replaced my eyes with others, and now I saw everything with greater clarity. The world continued the same, but I did not. It was as if I had passed through a veil. I began to understand that this influence is not only external, but that it infiltrates subtly through distraction, an overload of information, constant entertainment, all to keep us away from God's presence without us noticing. In the middle of the afternoon, almost at the end of the initial impact, one last thing happened. I was in my bedroom trying to rest a little when I had one last flash. A brief image, like a snapshot. I saw a crowd walking toward a huge tower, very similar to the Tower of Babel, but modern, made of steel and glass. People walked in a line, heads down, each holding an electronic device in their hands. No one looked at each other. No one spoke. They just walked, as if hypnotized. And at the top of the tower, an intense light pulsing as if it were a heart. But it wasn't a human heart. It was artificial. When I saw that, I had a strange certainty. The spirit of Babylon, once centered in kingdoms and kings, now spread through technology, through information, through the system. It is no longer an empire that dominates by war. Now it is an empire that dominates by distraction and seduction. I was shaken for the rest of the day. I couldn't turn on the television or pick up my cell phone for long. It was as if all of that had become contaminated. Not that the devices themselves were the problem, but I felt that something in them pulled me away from everything I had just experienced. I even began to look at social media with suspicion. The advertisements, the mass opinions, the controversies, everything seemed to work like a huge mechanism to distract and divide us. For the first time, I realized that perhaps the real spiritual war is not only happening in religious spheres, but also in everyday life, in culture, in what we consume without thinking. I felt vulnerable, exposed, as if I had been living until that moment asleep, thinking I was awake. It was as if the Spirit had given me a jolt of spiritual reality. Before going to sleep, I knelt and tried to thank God for showing me all of that. But the prayer wasn't beautiful. It was simple, amid tears and a bit of fear. Because yes, I felt fear, not of God, but of what I saw, of what I understood, and mainly of what is to come. I felt that time is running faster, and that this revelation was not meant to be kept only for me. It was a warning, a call to vigilance, to repentance, to real holiness. But I also felt that it was an invitation to hope. Because even amid so much deception, God still reveals himself. He still speaks. He still calls us out of the confusion. And the strangest part was that, even with so much weight and mystery, I went to sleep in peace. It wasn't the peace of ignorance. It was a different peace, the peace of someone who has been awakened in spirit even without understanding everything yet. The next morning, even though I had slept only a few hours, I woke up early with the feeling that something had changed. Inside me, it wasn't just the memory of the vision. It was as if I were carrying an invisible mark since that Sunday. I began the day more alert to everything. I observed conversations at work with different eyes. I noticed how we talk about empty things all the time, how we avoid deep spiritual topics as if they were uncomfortable. No one realizes that we are surrounded by a system that pushes us away from the truth. That day made me see how dangerous distraction is. I'm not saying that everything is wrong, but it is as if we were being anesthetized, little by little. And on that Sunday, God removed that anesthesia from my soul. I began to pray more throughout the day, not with memorized words, but with a restless heart. Everything seemed urgent, as if something were about to happen, and few were noticing. As the hours passed, I felt the need to write down what I had seen. I grabbed paper and pen, sat on the porch, and tried to put everything in order. The image of the lion with wings, the fall, the solitary eagle, the shadow taking shape, the hypnotized crowd. Everything was still fresh. But the more I wrote, the more I felt that it wasn't just about images. It was a message, a warning about the spirit of Babylon, which continues to act in disguise, deceiving even those who claim to know God. And perhaps that is why God allowed me to see it. Not because I was better than anyone else, but because I too was being deceived. I was also distracted. And now he was calling me back. It wasn't a cinematic miracle. There was no fire or lights, but it was something that changed my way of seeing the world. And that, for me, was stronger than any external manifestation. In the days that followed, I realized that the vision did not fade with time, like any ordinary dream. On the contrary, it seemed to gain layers. With every news item I read, with every advertisement that appeared, even in the songs playing on the radio, I saw elements that before had gone unnoticed. The glorification of the ego, the cult of success, the exaltation of the body, of image. All of that carried a trace of the same spirit I saw in that lion. The world revolves around one central idea. That man is the center of everything. That made me remember what God did to Nebuchadnezzar. He allowed him to live like an animal until he recognized that the Most High reigns. And now I wonder, are we close to seeing this kind of humiliation again, but on a global scale? Will modern empires, disguised as freedom and progress, be exposed in the same way? On one specific night that same week, I woke up with a heavy weight on my chest. It wasn't physical, it was something spiritual. I went to the living room, sat in the same spot where I had the vision, and began to pray again. But this time I didn't ask for revelations. I only asked for discernment. I asked not to lose myself in fear or in the pride of thinking that now I knew something. And there, in silence, I felt something that gave me chills. It was as if the Spirit were telling me that Babylon is not only in the structures of the world, but also within the church itself. And that disassembled me. I began to remember empty sermons, cults centered on man, leaderships driven by vanity. It was as if God was showing me that before judging the world outside, I needed to recognize that the spirit of Babylon had also infiltrated sacred places. And that made me even more alert. I began to remember an occasion when I went to a huge Christian event with thousands of people. Everything was very beautiful, very well produced, but there was something that now, in retrospect, bothered me. The name of God was present, of course, but the feeling was of a spectacle. Lights, rehearsed speeches, focus on performance, and at the time I didn't even notice. I felt touched, even moved. But today, after what I experienced, I realized that part of that environment carried the same elements of spiritual Babylon, the exaltation of man. Vanity disguised as anointing, distraction in the name of Christian entertainment. I'm not saying that everything was fake, but I clearly saw how the spirit that acts in the world can camouflage itself even within the faith. And that scared me deeply. Subtlety is the greatest danger. It doesn't come by destroying, it comes by convincing. After that understanding, I began to seek God's presence in a simpler, rawer way, without background music, without much structure, just me and Him. And it was in that place of simplicity that I began to hear more clearly. I'm not saying that I heard audible voices, but the thoughts that came were firm, different, with a peace that I recognized as coming from above. One of them struck me deeply. Do not become complacent with Babylon, even if it offers you comfort. That moved me, because the truth is that many of us have already become complacent. We feed off this system without realizing it. We accept its definitions of success, identity, and purpose. And when I looked at my own life, I saw that I had also become complacent. God showed me this, not to condemn me, but to awaken me. And I knew that from that moment on, my walk could never be the same. One of the things that struck me the most was realizing how the spirit of Babylon manifests itself through the illusion of control. Everything seems to be under human dominion, governments, economy, science. But behind that, there is a constant hunger for more power, more influence, more reach. And all of that is sold to us as progress, as freedom, when in reality we are being swallowed up by a structure that wants to shape even our thoughts. After the vision, I realized how narratives are carefully constructed, whether in the media, on social networks, or even in schools. There is a visible effort to disconnect us from the truth and to keep us too distracted, divided, and busy to notice what is really happening. And the most frightening thing is that most of us cooperate with this without even noticing. I did too, until that Sunday. I began to understand why, in the vision, the lion lost its wings before receiving a man's heart. The strength and the speed were taken away first. The pride was broken, and only then came the process of humanization. That was a key for me. Perhaps God allows great systems to fall, that modern empires be shaken, precisely so that humanity may again recognize who truly governs. It is not about politics, nor about one country or another. It is about a spirit that has risen against God since ancient times, and that now is reaching its maximum point of influence. Seeing that gave me fear, yes, but it also gave me direction. I understood that God's call in this time is for vigilance, for separation, for real holiness, not just external morality, but an internal separation. A heart that is not sold to the system, a heart that does not negotiate with Babylon. In the week following the vision, I had difficulties returning to my routine as if nothing had happened. I went to work, talked with people, did my tasks, but everything seemed out of place. I looked around and saw distracted faces, hearts too busy to notice that something was changing in the spiritual world. I myself had been like that, and that gave me a pain in my chest, a desire to scream, to warn, but not knowing exactly how. Because you can't just go up and say, I had a vision with a winged lion and God showed me that we are being seduced by modern Babylon. People wouldn't understand. Some would even mock, so I kept it to myself and I waited on God. I only shared with a few trusted people, but even so, I knew that this wasn't just for me. I still don't know how, but I am convinced that what I saw needs to be spoken of at the right time, in the right way. A curious thing that happened afterward was a kind of spontaneous cleansing in my life. Without planning, I began to get rid of some things that until then seemed harmless. Certain movies, books, habits. It wasn't a list of prohibitions, but an inner sense that those things no longer matched what God was doing inside me. I felt that He was calling me to a deeper holiness, not only in what I do, but in what I consume, what I think, what I accept as normal. I understood that spiritual Babylon does not dominate only by force, it conquers by conformity. Gradually, we become accustomed to things that once scandalized us. And before we know it, we are molded by the system, thinking we are free. This understanding hit me like a dose of reality, and it made me take difficult yet necessary decisions. Another day, several weeks after the vision, I went to a simple service in a small neighborhood church. Nothing grand in terms of structure. Just a few chairs, a keyboard, and an elderly pastor who spoke simply. And there, sitting in the back pew, I felt that weight on my spirit again. Not a vision, but something similar. An acute awareness of God's presence, mixed with a sense of urgency. The pastor read Daniel chapter 4, precisely the part where Nebuchadnezzar is humbled by God. I froze. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was as if God were confirming everything I had seen. At that moment, I began to cry silently, not because of the text itself, but for what I understood behind it. God is still speaking. He is still calling, and He does so directly, simply, often outside the grand stages. That was another confirmation that the experience I had was not a delirium or an exaggeration of my mind. It was real, and it continued to unfold. On the way home, I thought about how we complicate what God wants to show us. We wait for grand manifestations, signs in the sky, when many times the warning comes in an annoyance, in a break in routine, in a simple service, in a word read attentively. And on that Sunday of the vision, God used silence, isolation, to make me see what I had never noticed. I realized that we do not need to constantly seek new revelations. Sometimes what we need is to listen more deeply to what has already been spoken for centuries. Babylon fell, yes, but the spirit that moved that empire continues active, adapting to generations, to systems. And if we are not discerning, we end up being complicit. It is subtle, it is beautiful, it is seductive, but behind it, it is a spirit that hates everything that is holy and true. That awareness began to accompany me every day, and it led me to live more carefully. One of the most difficult things after the experience was realizing how confronting this spirit demands constancy. It is not enough to have had a striking vision or an impactful revelation. Day by day, the usual temptations return, the routine, the fatigue, the shortcuts, and the system that the Bible calls Babylon does not stop. It reinvents itself. One day it is entertainment, the next it is politics, then ideology, then religion. It is everywhere. And sometimes I feel tired of fighting against it. But then I remember what I saw: the broken lion, the torn wings, the wounded eagle, the shadow taking shape. That wasn't fantasy. It was a warning. And every time I think about giving in, that memory returns like a wall. It is not about fear, but about responsibility. God showed me why He wants me to stay awake, because if I sleep, I am swallowed again, perhaps without even realizing it. As time passed, I began to understand that this experience was not just for me, but for others as well. I began to notice people around me awakening, asking questions, disturbed by the way things were going. Without me saying anything, some friends came to mention that they were feeling something strange is happening in the world. Others began to distance themselves from distractions on their own. That brought me relief, because it showed me that God is blowing this awakening in many places. It is not about apocalyptic fear, but about real discernment, about understanding that we can no longer live as before. The structures are changing. The appearance of the world remains functional, but something inside is crumbling. And those with spiritual eyes are beginning to notice. Seeing that happening with others gave me the strength to continue, to not be silent, to remain vigilant. One thing that still impresses me to this day is how everything began in such a simple way, an ordinary Sunday, a sincere prayer without expectations, and suddenly a plunge into something I couldn't control or foresee. And that taught me so much about the way God speaks. He doesn't need grand settings. He waits for a willing heart, and in the right time, He reveals. What I saw that day changed my way of looking at life. I'm not talking about perfection or instant holiness. I still struggle with things inside me, but now every decision carries a different weight. I can no longer consume content without filtering it. I can't just say anything, laugh at anything, get involved with anything, because I understood that when we surrender to the molds of Babylon, we open spiritual breaches that weaken us without us noticing. And that is exactly what the enemy wants: a distracted, divided, and domesticated people. I returned several times to that passage in Daniel, trying to understand why God would use such strong images to represent kingdoms. And over time, I began to understand that these figures are not just about political or military power. They are about spiritual nature. Each beast represents a way of acting, of dominating, of seducing. And the lion with eagle's wings, strong, fast, imposing, is the portrait of a force that conquers through arrogance, through control, through the appearance of grandeur. When the wings are torn away, that arrogance is broken. But the strangest thing is that even after the fall, the spirit continues to exist, like something dormant, waiting for a new way to manifest. And that is what I see today. Not anymore with crowns and armies, but with algorithms, cultural influence, narrative control. Babylon was never just a place. It is a mentality, a system, a real spiritual force. After all of that, I also began to understand that God allows certain revelations not only for personal edification, but for collective preparation. Since that day, I have felt that we are on the verge of seeing very deep changes in the world, not only political or economic, but spiritual. And whoever has their eyes closed will be carried along without even noticing what is happening. I'm not saying this for sensationalism. I speak with fear. I feel that, just as Babylon fell overnight, the modern system in which many trust will also be shaken. The difference is that today it is global, faceless, spread throughout everything, and when it falls, it will leave many people without footing, because many have built their lives upon it. That was when I understood why God showed me that man's heart being given to the lion. He still wants to reach people. He still wants them to awaken. He still wants to save. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about what would have happened if I had ignored that moment. If I had simply said, it was just something in my head. Maybe I would have continued life as usual, but I know I would have lost something very precious. Not only the impact of the vision itself, but all that it provoked afterward. The repentance, the zeal, the vigilance, and most importantly, the awareness of the spiritual urgency we are living in. I don't know what God will show me in the future, nor if I will have another experience like that. But one thing I know, since that day, I am no longer the same, and I can no longer pretend that I didn't see. It is as if I had received a spiritual password, a code of warning that forces me to look at everything with different eyes. Even when I wanted to return to normalcy, I can't anymore. The mark remains, and with it comes the responsibility to not be silent. One of the questions that resonates within me the most since then is, who really is governing the world today? I'm not only talking about visible politicians or leaders, I'm talking about what is behind, about the forces that influence decisions, that control what we see, what we think, what we accept as truth. The vision made me realize that there is an invisible conflict happening all the time, and that a large part of humanity is blind to it. And the worst part, many who call themselves Christians are also asleep, not out of malice, but out of complacency. Babylon is seductive. It does not appear as an enemy, but as a friend. It offers comfort, freedom, entertainment, everything that pleases the flesh. But it gradually steals our spiritual sensitivity. When I realized that, I felt despair, as if we were on a battlefield, and most were with their eyes closed, playing instead of fighting. Another point that struck me greatly was the symbolism of the wings being torn away. That kept echoing in my mind for weeks. It was as if God were saying, I myself will tear away what you use to exalt yourself. The wings gave speed, dominion, an appearance of celestial power, but they also represented pride, vanity, autonomy. And when they are torn away comes the fall, comes weakness. But also comes the opportunity to have a transformed heart. Perhaps that is what is about to happen with the current systems. I see powers that once seemed untouchable beginning to sway. Fragile financial structures, deep moral crises, a generalized fatigue. And perhaps, just as happened with the lion in the vision, the moment of humiliation is coming, not through total destruction, but through mercy, so that anyone who wishes may still receive a new heart. Since that day, I have taken greater care with everything that involves my faith, not because I've become paranoid or legalistic, but because now I understand that there is a real spiritual conflict being waged, and modern Babylon is much more effective than the ancient one. It has learned not to impose itself by force, but by desire. It offers everything that pleases the ego, and those who are not attentive surrender easily. It took a vision, an almost inexplicable experience for me to see that. But even if I never see something like it again, it has already been enough. Today, my prayer is that I never fall asleep again, that I remain vigilant, and that God uses my life, even silently, to awaken others. Because the feeling I carry to this day is that the vision is still unfolding, that what I saw was only the beginning of something much greater, There was a moment right after the experience when I tried to recount everything in detail to someone close. The person listened respectfully, but deep down I realized that they did not understand the weight of it all. And that's okay. Not everyone will understand. Some will only awaken when they are directly touched. But what left me thoughtful was that person's look, as if I had spoken of just any dream. And I knew it wasn't. Because even today, when I close my eyes, I can still see that lion. I can feel the roar, the weight, the invisible presence that surrounded me in that room. It wasn't invented. It was an encounter. And even without understanding all the meanings, I know I was marked. And I know that this mark was not only for me. There are many being called in this time silently to get out of Babylon, even while living within it. To this day, I cannot explain everything I saw. I don't know why God chose that day or why He showed me exactly those figures, but I know it was real. I know it was meant for me, and I know that I have carried a piece of it with me since then. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and remember the hypnotized crowd walking toward that tower, and I wonder how many more are still walking without noticing. What else will God allow to happen to awaken the world? I don't know. But I feel that we are close, very close. Something is coming. Something that will separate those who truly hear God's voice from those who have merely become accustomed to the noise of Babylon. And that fills me with dread. Because once you see, you can't unsee. And I saw.